Hello and welcome back to Seeing Things Differently. My name is Alicia, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about understanding what's happening. I'm joined in today's episode by my lovely mum, Sandy.
Hello, everybody. As Alicia says, I'm her mum, Sandy, and also mum to a son as well. And just over 10 years ago, my husband, Neil, was diagnosed with a rare form of dementia called PCA.
Lovely, thank you. And so the reason that we have Sandy here with us today is because I thought that it might be quite helpful for the topic we're discussing of understanding what's happening to have a perspective of both a parent and a child in the situation. So the episode is going to be exploring understanding what's happening at home when maybe you've noticed that there's something not quite right with mum or dad. Maybe you've not got a diagnosis yet, or parents haven't said anything to you yet, and it can be a very confusing place to be. So hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll be feeling a bit more comfortable with learning how to ask parents questions and understanding what's happening. So as you said, Dad was given a diagnosis of a rare dementia when my brother and I were quite a bit younger. And so obviously we didn't know what was going on straight away. So I wonder, Mum, if you could set the scene for us of what was happening in our household before you and Dad had the confirmed diagnosis.
Well, it was a really unsettling time. We knew something was wrong. We'd been, we'd raised this, and we were lucky enough to kind of get into the system quick enough. And it took us over a year to get diagnosed, but by a lot of standards, that's really quick. But it was a really difficult year where we were struggling with understanding what was going on and worried about what the diagnosis was likely to be, and not really feeling in a position to share that kind of information with you at that time.
Yeah, and I think from my side anyway, it was an odd place to be at that time in the house because obviously you hadn't told us anything. We didn't know what was going on, even with the hospital visits and appointments. But it was becoming quite clear that, we might enter a room and there's more of a hushed conversation happening, or the topic changes quite quickly. And so you started to pick up that, okay, maybe there's something being discussed here that either I'm not part of or they don't want me to be a part of. And it felt quite confusing and kind of lonely as well at the same time, I would say. So
Yeah.
just wondering why didn't you tell my brother and I at that point?
I think, well, we obviously didn't do as good a job as we thought we were doing of keeping stuff from you. I think we really wanted to keep things as normal as possible and not alarm you unnecessarily.
Yeah.
We really didn't know what we were dealing with. And I think from, your dad's perspective, it was a really unsettling time for him. And, he was very private, very proud man, and just needed to be in control of things himself, I think.
Yeah. And now thinking about when you and Dad did actually have the diagnosis, so you'd been told that it was a rare form of dementia called PCA.
Yeah.
What was that like? Set the scene for us there.
Well, it was quite overwhelming to begin with. One, we'd never heard of it before. Whilst we'd heard of dementia and Alzheimer's, this was something quite different.
Yeah.
So it was a lot to get our head around, but we did realise, because things were going to change, because his diagnosis meant that he was going to have to take ill health early retirement. He was going to be home. So we knew there would be questions. So we knew we had to sit down with you both and give you some information. And I think the decision there was to obviously bring you up to date with what was going on, but at the same time, not overwhelm you, and not scare you. And in all honesty, we were learning about it as well. So we didn't even have all the answers.
Yeah, and I think that's something common with any form of rare dementia, is that typically you get the diagnosis and the families may have no idea what this is. It's taken, ages to get there, and then you have very limited information. So for anyone affected by rare dementia, I have linked down below in the description some support services that you might want to access for help with rarer dementias. But in terms of how I felt at that time, obviously we had the conversation, you sat us down and you told us. And I think actually my initial sort of reaction, of course, we were upset for Dad, and it was hard to understand. It was hard to process. And it wasn't something that we just understood straight away. But I think I actually moved out of a state of confusion and more into sort of anger and a very sort of frustrated way of being upset, because it felt like I was right. So there was something happening that I wasn't supposed to know about, and I've been excluded in that way. But B, also, this is a lot. Like you just said, even for adults to try and understand a diagnosis like that is complicated. So yeah, I think it just left me personally feeling quite confused, upset, and frustrated. And I think the same for my brother as well.
Yeah, and I, I get that, and I think I would potentially, as a tip, say have the conversations early.
Yeah.
I mean, hindsight is a great thing. I think we were really just so worried about not panicking you.
Yeah, and I think it
so
was
young.
Yeah, and it was hard to know what to do with the information at that point anyway, because I mean, things weren't obvious.
No.
Sure, there were a few things that we noticed where dad might have a bit of difficulty sort of reading his watch or something, or there were a few scrapes on the car, but we weren't present for those happening. So my brother and I hadn't really seen anything that would indicate this diagnosis, or that dad was ill, and so it was hard to know what to do with the information that he was ill, because he looks fine to me. And I think that's kind of a hard one for a lot of people with rarer dementias in those early stages, is you give people the information and then it almost doesn't seem useful because there's not any changes that you're observing.
And I think it's understanding the progressive and almost slowly progressive nature of your dad's condition. I know every other rare dementia is slightly different, but for us, it took some years really before it was almost obvious to the naked eye. Strangers wouldn't necessarily pick on stuff, but we would, because we know,
because you're seeing it day to day. So you're seeing that kind of even though it's very minor, that kind of decline in an ability from one day to the next. But it's very easy for people, well, not easy, but people with dementia can sort of turn on this, okay, I'm socializing with people externally, and sort of put more of a front on to cover some of those symptoms, but that's much harder to do at home. So
totally. And I think it's just about I guess from your perspective and Thomas's perspective, I know if you ever asked me something, I would tell you honestly. But I think I was a bit worried about giving information without it being sought after.
So that being said, what would you have done had I come to you and said, Mum, clearly there's conversations going on that I don't really understand. What's happening?
I would have started with asking, what is it you want to know?
Okay.
Because I think there is a danger when someone says what's going on, that I could suddenly give you so much and then terrify you. I do remember Thomas sort of asking me once, am I going to get this? And once I said, there's nothing that indicates that you would.
There's not a genetic link that we found with this type of dementia.
And it's almost like once I could answer that one very important question for him, he was able then to ask other things about his dad and what it was likely to be. So I think my tip would be, sort of encourage people to ask questions. But ask them what is it that they really want to know. Don't assume they need verse and chapter.
No, I think that's a really good tip. And how do you think dad would have reacted if I'd approached him before you'd sat us down and said what was wrong and asked him, what's going on?
I think, everybody's different. And your dad was a very private man and very proud man. And he would not have wanted to concern you. So I think if you'd have asked him, he probably would have brushed you off, to be honest with you. I think he probably would have said, everything's okay, you don't need to worry. He would have possibly made up some other excuse rather than I know he was always,
because I remember for a time actually it was kind of said like, oh, it's stress at work, and just labeled as he's busy at work, so kind of don't add any pressure to dad sort of thing. I think
that's one of the things. Before we got a proper diagnosis, he was having a really difficult time at work, and he was under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress with his job, so we did think that it could have all been stress. So we weren't sure, and that was an easier, more palatable, more acceptable thing to say it was.
I think because it's a lot more temporary, saying that
Yeah.
it's stress at work, that's something that indicates you can fix that and make a change and things will go back to normal. But obviously having to break the news to anyone that somebody in the family is affected by a type of dementia, and particularly a rare form of dementia, it's not something that you just think, oh, okay, I get that, I know what that means. It takes a lot of information and understanding and seeking support to actually, even now, I think, we're not completely in a place where we really understand fully what his illness is or exactly how to kind of care for someone with that. So it's a process, and I think it requires people on both sides of that conversation to really keep that conversation open. And if that is something that you're worried that you might struggle with after you've spoken to your parents or to your children, then please refer back to our original video, Starting the Conversation, which has some great tips for just maintaining that open conversation within the family dynamic. So now thinking about other families and people who may have just received a diagnosis, or maybe kids at home watching this who feel like maybe there's something wrong at home, but they're not quite sure how to ask. What are some tips that you would share as a parent and who's been in this situation before?
So I think be brave.
Yeah.
On both sides. It takes courage, and it's a difficult thing for people to be going through.
Yeah.
So, deep breath and ask the question. I think for parents, it's be honest. I think we always have this drive to protect, but actually not being clear is almost being unkind.
Yeah.
So I think, answer as fully as you can. And as I said earlier, ask them what specifically do they want to know, because I think invariably kids will come up and say, what's happening? And actually it might be what's happening now, what's going to be happening in the future, what's happening to mum, what's happening to dad, or what's happening to me. So I think being able to ask the question, what is it you want to know specifically, might be a good starter.
And I think along those lines as well of being honest, that kind of goes for the whole family, really, because I think back, and you've obviously said, you never asked us. And I think I had these feelings and I wasn't being honest with how I was feeling at the time, of very confused and upset. And rather than coming to you and trying to have a conversation, I just kind of pushed it down and tried to dismiss it. So I think for kids as well, be as honest as you can be with your parents or with someone that you feel safe and comfortable with. I mean,
and I think that's something to build on. I think there's a couple of things that you've mentioned there. That one, for parents, don't be afraid of showing your emotion in front of your children. And likewise, children, obviously don't be afraid, but also don't try and minimize it. I think it's recognizing that it's a difficult time for everybody.
I think one of the most helpful, which sounds odd, but one of the most helpful things for me was actually one day seeing you and dad crying. And it was horrible to watch, because no one likes to see anyone that they care about upset. But actually for me, seeing you both in tears, kind of holding each other, it made me realize a lot of the anger I was feeling of, you didn't tell me before and I've been left out. I took everything very personally at the time, of clearly I didn't deserve to know, or it wasn't worth telling me, and I felt very excluded from the family unit almost. I don't know if it's the same for Thomas, but it was easy to feel quite isolated. And suddenly seeing you two have those emotions that I was feeling, when in my mind you were both fine and there was nothing wrong, that actually made it easier for me to actually start talking about the issue and admit that, okay, I'm not okay, you guys aren't okay either. I can finally say I'm not okay, and now we can work through this as a family, rather than everyone kind of keeping to themselves. So I think just showing honest emotion, when obviously safe to do so, and when you can.
Exactly. And recognizing that you're all going through this together. And I think the other thing that you kind of touched on was talk to someone. Sometimes it's not easy talking to your mum and dad about these things. So, if you have an aunt or an uncle or a good friend or a school friend or a teacher, somebody who can just listen to you and help, and they may not have the answers, but they might be able to come back to your parents and ask, and be like the go-between, or a buffer or something.
And I know that you and daddy always encouraged Thomas and I. It wasn't Dad was proud and didn't want people knowing. So it wasn't a tell anyone and everyone,
No.
but it was if you need that support, you can talk to your teachers, let them know what's happening at home. Don't try and sit with it all for yourself. And you did even encourage us, therapy, if that's the option for you, which I think
absolutely
a lot of families could look at, even as group therapy for something like that could be quite useful. So
and I think, it's also, as a parent, don't be offended if your brother, sister, teacher calls you up and says, look, your son, daughter has approached me with this, and I don't know, I need to understand a bit more. Don't think, why did they not come to me? It's just being part of that. And also, we were really lucky. We had a great neurologist who actually, when we got the diagnosis and we're talking about how do we tell the kids, had actually said and offered to speak to both you and Thomas if we didn't feel able to have that conversation, explain things calmly enough, clearly enough, etc. So I think, another tip would be, so it all comes down to enlist any support that you need to help your children get to grips with this and know that you're in it together.
And I think maybe my last tip sort of for kids, and I suppose parents as well, but is be patient, because actually your parents might be dealing with a lot behind the scenes that you don't know about. Like you said before, you told us there was a lot going on with all the different hospital tests and visits that even you didn't really fully understand. So how could you have been expected to kind of relay that information? So if you ask a question and you maybe don't get a clear answer or the answer that you were hoping for, so try not to push. Try to just recognize that, as we said before, everyone in the family is in this together, to maybe differing degrees of needing to offer care and support, but you're all in this together. And be patient, because everyone will take the time to process the information kind of at their own pace.
But
and
come back to the question at a later date. Don't think you can't ask because you've not got the answer back at that time. As you said, there's a lot going on, not just the diagnosis, the financial elements could be playing a part, the whole housing situation, the dynamics of the relationship within the family itself could be changing in terms of who's responsible for whom as you go along. So if you ask and you don't get the answer or all the information, respect that there might be more going on behind the scenes, but don't not ask again.
So just give yourself a kind of gap in the middle and come back when maybe things seem a bit calmer or it seems a more appropriate time to ask the question. Excellent. So we've covered quite a few helpful tips there, or at least I know they would have been helpful for me when I was at the start of this journey. I've been joined today by my lovely mum, Sandy.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
If I could just offer an additional tip, it is just keep the dialogue going, just keep talking, ask questions, both children to their parents, parents to their kids, checking in. I think that's
keeping that open conversation.
Keeping that open conversation going.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think your input has been really, really helpful today. So in this episode, we have discussed understanding what's happening. We've talked about understanding feelings and what might be going on before parents tell you about a diagnosis. We've talked about those thoughts and feelings when you are told about the diagnosis and what's happening. We've also spoken about what we may have done slightly differently, and hopefully those tips will be helpful for you in learning what to do and not to do as you go forward with your dementia journey. And lastly, we finished off with some helpful tips that will hopefully make it a lot easier for you to maintain and keep that conversation going. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.